Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for this expert briefing on alternative global scenarios and African futures. My name is Sabina Vasiloy, and I'm a sociocultural analyst with the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub, in short, NSDS Hub. It's my absolute pleasure to be facilitating today's discussion. This is the first installment in our Southern Talks webinar series. This series of webinars is essentially intended to help audiences inside and outside of NATO to make sense of the challenges, current and future, that nations in the south of the alliance are facing, and just as importantly, the opportunities available to address them. We have a very special guest here today, Mr. Yaki Cilliers, the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. For those of you who may be less familiar with this outfit, this is a Pan-African organization with staff from 22 African countries and regional offices across the continent. Mr. Yaki Cilliers currently serves as chair of the ISS Board of Trustees and head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at the Pretoria office of ISS. I will let him elaborate further on the African Futures Program and the work of ISS, but for now, I'll just explain that our joint objective today is to help raise awareness of the type of global scenarios that we might see emerging over the next 2 decades and the long-term trends that could be shaping the future of the African continent going forward. For us here at the NSDS Hub, today is also about highlighting an important Pan-African perspective. Whereas nations in the West, in NATO, are understandably preoccupied with the crisis in Ukraine, concerned by instances of conflict, fragility, and instability in the south of NATO, today we'll turn the conversation on its head and we'll hear about the ways in which the African continent might be impacted by global developments, most prominently by great power competition and unsustainable economic growth. This type of informal exchanges with stakeholders from the South is very much part of our DNA here at the NSDS Hub, as we strive to develop a deeper and a shared understanding of the key issues that are not constrained by geography. Lastly, before I hand over to Yaki, please allow me to very briefly go over a few housekeeping issues. So today's session is being recorded and will be posted on our NSDS Hub website later on for those who are unable to join us today. We will also be circulating at the end of our event a short feedback form where you are welcome to post comments and suggestions on how we can improve in the future. Yaki's briefing will last about 20 to 30 minutes, and after that I will open the floor for questions and answers. You are welcome to post your questions throughout the session using the chat box feature on Zoom. We'll endeavor to have Yaki answer all of the questions, do all of the hard work, while we unreasonably attempt to take some of the credit. So on that note, Yaki, again, good morning, you're welcome. And you now have the floor to brief us about ISS and the remarkable work that you have been doing to forecast Africa's future.
Sabina, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity, and great to see you again, as well as to connect with colleagues. Sabina, I'm going to share screen, and everything that I'm going to do is on the website that I'm now going to show you, and I'm going to be presenting from that website. So this is the front page of a very large website that we have been developing and that was launched in June of last year. This website includes forecasts for every African country. I'm just scrolling through them there to show you that I'm actually, it is true. For every African region, for every of the African 8 regional economic communities that are recognized as such by the Africa Union and for the various country income groups recognized by the World Bank. The website also allows you, sorry, let me just go to the right. The website, we do the forecast for every African country in a number of scenarios. So we start off, of course, with where Africa is headed on its so-called current path. So if I go to the thematic portion, this is where we think Africa is headed, or where every African country is headed on the forecast that we've done. And then we forecast the future of every of those African countries and regions that I showed you in terms of what is the impact of improved governance, a demographic dividend, the impact of an agricultural revolution, investments in health and watch, better education, a manufacturing transition, a full implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, the impact of technological leapfrogging, more inward financial flows, and investments in large infrastructure. These are the 8 scenarios that we forecast for each of Africa's 54 countries, regions, and we do that out till 2043. 2043 is the end of the third 10-year implementation plan of the Africa Union's development agenda for Africa, its long-term development agenda known as Agenda 2063. Once we've done that, we look at the impact of all of these scenarios on work and jobs, as well as on the impact of it on climate change and energy. And we look at the impact, and we then look at the combined impact of these scenarios on Africa's future. Recently, we started with an effort to also look at how global developments will impact on Africa, and which is what I'm going to be speaking about today. So that is where we refer to what we refer to as Africa in the world, how global developments will impact on Africa. So I'm going to go to the top of that page, which is what I'm going to be speaking about. Now, in the last 2 weeks, The Economist magazine published 2 issues. I'm going to show them here. The one issue really was about, are we looking at what they refer to as peak China? And the second edition, which came out on the 20th, was Should America Lead? Now, what The Economist did, they looked at what we refer to as global, how power in the world is shifting. And they were saying, as you would recognize from the work Peak China, that China is almost at its peak power and that its power is going to remain relatively constant, and that in actual fact, America remains globally the most powerful country in the world. And this is based on complex matrices and indices that they've used to look at the future. Our forecasts differ a little bit. We use the International Futures Forecasting Platform that is hosted and developed at the University of Denver in the United States. We've been collaborating for them for a long time. And our forecasts are that, in actual fact, the Chinese economy will overtake that of the American economy in size in about 10 years' time, about 2033, 2032. At that point, using measures of market exchange rates, China is the largest economy in the world. And then about a decade later, around 2044, around 2043, China becomes the most powerful country in the world. Now, power is determined by investments in military, the size of your economy, population size, technology, and so on. So we don't believe that China has peaked. In actual fact, we believe that about 2043, China becomes the single most powerful country in the world. But that measure doesn't really help a lot, because China is relatively isolated. It is surrounded by countries that fear it, whereas the United States is at the center of a Western alliance that has got much more broader, significant power and potential power. In actual fact, we believe that the so-called West would continue to dominate in terms of income and wealth well into the second part of the century, despite the fact that China individually becomes, by 2043, around there, the single most powerful country in the world. So we, of course, look at Africa and the world. How does this global power, shift in global power, impact upon Africa and Africa's future? So I'm showing you the front page of our page on Africa and the world, and everything I'm going to show you now is available on the website. I'm going to scroll to the left and come to something where I can see all the charts, because the first thing I want to show you is the scenario framework that I'm going to be speaking about, which is this. So we have two axes, globalization and sustainability, that gives you 4 worlds. If you use an interconnected globalized world versus the trend towards nationalist populism as one axis, and you look at low levels of mitigation versus high levels of mitigation and adaptation, it gives you 4 worlds: a sustainable world, divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. And I'm going to explain the characteristics of each. But before I do that, I first want to sort of make you aware of the gap we see between Africa and the rest of the world. So this is a chart that shows average GDP per capita between Africa and 2 comparable global regions, the other 2 poor regions of the world, namely South Asia and South America. On the website, you can see how we define South Asia. On the left-hand side is constant 2017 US dollars, and at the bottom is time from 2000 with a forecast for 2043. Until about here is data, and you can there see the clear impact of, for example, of COVID on our forecasts. So this is GDP per capita for Africa. This is GDP per capita for South Asia and South America. The point I simply want to make is whichever indicator you use, the gap between average incomes in Africa and average incomes in the rest of the world has widened since 1960, since independence in the 1960s, and it is set to widen constantly over time. So things are improving in Africa, but more slowly than in the rest of the world. One of the things that we have a look, that we measure, the influence. Now, influence is difficult to measure, but we use an index developed by our colleagues at the RD Center in Denver. And this is the sum of influence of the European Union, in this case 28 members, because the UK, for ill-effective purposes, when we're looking at influence, can be considered as part of the EU. We look at influence versus the EU, 28 versus China, Russia, and the US on all African countries. And this is historical data from 1991 to 2019. So it's an index. This is the combined influence that the EU 28 have on Africa. This is the combined influence that the US has on Africa. This is China. You can see China rising, and this is Russia at the bottom. So in the website, you can read how this indicator of influence, which is very difficult to measure, is constructed. It includes trade and aid and all those kind of things. And then how we measure this. It's purely an indicator, but what it indicates is very clearly how EU influence has declined over time, how that of China is increasing over time, but that even by, in this case, 2019, the influence of the combined EU 28 is about 3 times larger than that of China. Of course, the gap is narrowing, but this is a first sort of step that I wanted to highlight when we look at power, influence. And you get different types of power. You get hard power, soft power, and influence is a type of soft power. Now, there are 2 trends that have an impact on how power is shifting when we look long term. The first is a trend, what we refer to as the trend towards regionalism. In other words, regions like Asia, Africa, South America, North America, are in a sense decoupling from the global commons. This is part of the trend towards a more divided world. So the West no longer dominates, and regions, particularly Asia, is integrating and to a degree decoupling from the global commons. That's the first trend, on top of the shifts in power and influence. The second trend is a trend of what we refer to as power diffusion. This is perhaps not that evident in Russia and China, but in almost the entire rest of the world, you see that governments, the state, is losing power as modern technology and the internet and everything else is empowering the local. In this complex, crowded world, it's more difficult to govern. And the power of the state, who doesn't control the media and doesn't control the flow of information, is increasingly contested. So those are two additional trends we have to have a look at. Now I want to return to the summary, the scenarios that I spoke about. So here is a summary of each of the global, at the global level of those four scenarios. Let's start with the sustainable world. This is the most difficult to achieve because it requires choice, it requires leadership and determined implementation, possibly in the face of climate change. It could also be triggered by the peaceful democratization of China, Russia, and the Middle East. Remember, our forecasts are over 2 decades. It is a future reflected through global lower consumption, constrained global greenhouse emissions. There's a fully operational World Trade Organization, effective antitrust legislation and action, and a reformed global financial architecture. So the sustainable world is a rules-based world with minimum corporate tax rates, nuclear disarmament, and a reformed, legitimate, and effective UN Security Council. It's an ideal world. In a sense, I started off by showing you the website that we've developed. We've in actual fact developed Africa's growth potential in this kind of ideal sustainable world. But we are more likely headed towards this kind of world, a divided world. A divided world is a world of clubs. It's a world where the G7, the BRICS, and the non-aligned movement play an important role, and it's a retreat from a rules-based order. So in the United States, somebody like Donald Trump is elected in 2024, and there's bickering and divisions between the US and with the European Union, which weakens the West. And there isn't a global consensus on climate change, but there is still quite a bit of regional action. So your mitigation and adaptation is weakened. I mean, this tense world, the gap between a rich West and the global South widens, amidst widening xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment. So this is the second global world. The third is a world at war. So this is a world where the war between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, broadens into a war that eventually draws in NATO, possibly China on the side of, in support of Russia. China uses that opportunity in a sense of diversion to invade Taiwan. Eventually, there is war and conflict between China and India as two rising global powers. So this is bipolarity on steroids. The global economy, of course, is smaller and so on. A growth world, this is sort of new liberal world of trickle-down economics. I always joke this is where Elon Musk owns everything. High corporate tax rates and high inequality. So everybody grows, but it is eventually unsustainable. So these are the four global futures that we have modeled. Associated with each of these global futures, we have developed an African scenario. I'm not going to speak about that African scenarios, but I started off by showing you the front page of the very large website with over 4,000 charts on it that we developed that really looks at Africa's development potential in the sustainable world, because it basically makes the case for what is Africa's development potential, given the reality that that the gap between Africa and the rest of the world constantly grows over time. So I'm going to now go to actual fact, a summary of our findings, of our scenarios, to show you some of our findings, to show you what is the impact of these various scenarios. I'm going to, well, I'm going to start with this, which is perhaps, given that this is something hosted by NATO, this is global military expenditure in 2019 versus each of those four scenarios in 2043. So whereas global military expenditure in 2019 was about $2.1 trillion in 2017 constant dollars, in a divided world it's about $4.5 trillion, and in the world at war it's about $8.7 trillion. So we have modeled that. We've looked at what happens with global military expenditure. One indicator of the difference between these various scenarios. This is an indication of what happens. Apologies, let me go to the right shot. This is an indication of the size of the African economy versus the economy in the rest of the world in each of these four global scenarios compared to 2019. So in 2019, in the world economy, African was about $3 trillion. The size of the total African economy was about $3 trillion. The size of the rest of the world's economy is about $97 trillion. In 2043, the size of the African economy will be about $11.5 trillion. The size of the economy of the rest of the world will be about $161 trillion. And there you can see, of course, as you would expect, the size of the world economy is the smallest in the world at war scenario. It is about, what is it? About $135 trillion. And the African economy is only about $6.6 trillion of that. So this is another indication of the impact that these global scenarios have on Africa, our size of the total African economy of all 54 African countries versus the total size of the economy of the rest of the world. Africa is about 3.5% of the world economy. And it grows, but it grows slowly. The rest of the world continues to grow more rapidly. Another way to look at Africa would be to look at GDP per capita. So I started off, one of the first charts I showed you was the growing gap in GDP per capita between Africa and the rest of the world. This is a chart that is from 2000, forecast until 2043. This is GDP per capita in Africa, and this is GDP per capita in the rest of the world. Again, you can see the impact of the COVID pandemic. And this is GDP per capita in Africa in the world at war scenario. You can see it remains almost flat from 2000. This is in the divided world, which is probably the closest to where we are headed. This is in a growth world, and this is in a sustainable world. Africa does the best in a sustainable world scenario. But you can see the gap between GDP per capita in Africa and the rest of the world. This is GDP per capita in the world at war scenario for the rest of the world. It basically remains flat. And that should be a stark reminder of the impact that the growing tensions could have if what happens in Ukraine spills out of control. The world does the best in a growth world scenario, while Africa does the best in a sustainable world scenario. And that, of course, there are many reasons why that is the case. We can also look, that's another measure of the various scenarios that we've done. We can also look at, for example, carbon emissions. And this is carbon emissions in each of those global scenarios. I'm not going to really discuss this. That, of course, is the growth world. That, of course, are the other three scenarios: the sustainable world, the divided world, the world at war, and the growth world. Growth world, of course, accompanied by significant carbon emissions. And then finally, to compare these different scenarios, just to look at the impact of extreme poverty. And this is a chart that shows extreme poverty in Africa. Now, at the moment, in 2019, and this is in millions of people, about 400, in 2019, almost 500 million Africans lived below the extreme poverty line of $1.90. Only 860 million Africans lived above that extreme poverty line. So, and this is what it would be like in each of the different scenarios by 2043. In the divided world, Africa's population grows to close to over 2.1 billion people. Of about 1.9 billion of them live above $1.90, about 195 million live in extreme poverty. And of course, in the world at war, population is both larger because fertility rates increase, and poverty is much, much higher. So I'm going to conclude by going to sort of the top part of this page to take you through sort of our main conclusions on the work that we've done. And I've only touched on some of those conclusions. So this is known as sort of our top 10 takeaways. The first, and I spoke a little bit about this given the audience, is that China will overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world before mid-century, both in economic size and in power. The West, however, will remain dominant globally and maintain a technological and wealth advantage even over a possible China-Russia axis. Russia, although despite its nuclear weapons and its efforts at disruption, is not a global power in the same sense as the United States, the European Union, or the US. The second major takeaway is, of course, there are many things that can disrupt this. In addition to the accelerated impact of climate change, 4 events could disrupt this broad structural trend. The democratization of China, which will be hugely disruptive, not only for China, but globally, for the global economy, because it will inevitably be accompanied by economic disruption. Second, ongoing polarization, eventual conflict in the US. If we maybe can't agree on increasing the debt ceiling or whatever happens, the divisions between the US, between the Republicans and the Democrats, it gets out of hand. And quite a bit has been written about what we refer to as great power implosion. Substantial expansion or contraction of the European Union. In our scenarios, and we see that already, Europe emerges as much more of a powerful actor globally, but a lot depends on what happens if it expands or contracts. Britain decides to rejoin, Turkey is allowed, Russia, and so on. And then there's the issue of political integration and reorientation in Asia. Asia is increasingly economic integrated, but not politically integrated. What happens if a political framework is provided in Asia? Does that Asia then emerge as a global power? The third major takeaway is that future relations between the US and the European Union and India's foreign policy orientations will therefore affect the future balance of power and the nature of that order. With the growth of the global South, this is a future of more regionalism. And I spoke a little bit about that. Complex multipolarity, complicated, crowded, flat world, and likely a growing divide between the rich West and the rest. And this is a trend that concerns us a lot, driven, of course, by xenophobia, migration, and so on. The fourth major takeaway is that the war in Ukraine and the fear of China's rising influence is having significant collateral effects. And that in our view, looking at this from an African perspective, the West needs to differentiate between China and Russia and resist simplistic narratives that put a benevolent West against bad China associated with evil Russia in Africa. And luckily, I think this trend, there is considerable momentum on dealing with this, and the hostility that we see between, and Europe in particular is dealing with, mediating some of the hostility between the US and China. Fifth major trend, Africa to develop and reduce poverty, it needs China. It needs the European Union, and it needs the US. It cannot make a choice between any of them, even as its development future will increasingly be determined by rising Asia. The global growth worldwide is shifting from west to east. If you want to grow, you need to be linked with Asia. Not that the West is declining, but that's where global growth comes from. And Africa needs the money from the West. It needs the access to the markets in Europe, and well as trade with China. Number 6, the world should avoid false choices. On the one hand, the Communist Party will not abandon its collectivist views on politics and development, and nor will democratic countries abandon their belief in individual freedoms and rights. And from an African perspective, the most important development, we need stability. We need the West to rebuild the relations with China. Number 7, Africa's foreign and development policy should unequivocally advance geopolitical stability, avoid being instrumentalized, whether that is on Ukraine or on Taiwan, pursue sustainable growth and a next generation rules-based system that also provides space for Africa to develop and grow. Of course, not all African leaders are committed to national development. I mean, think of Equatorial Guinea, Eswatini, and some countries are currently unable to participate in that. I mean, just think of countries in Somalia, countries in the Sahel, and so on. Thus, Africa should consider a two-speed approach where some countries commit earlier to higher governance standards than others. The current trajectory to a divided world, which is sort of more or less where we are doing, constrain Africa's development. So in a sustainable world, the world economy will be about $184 trillion. African economy will only be about 7.9% of that. And GDP per capita, even in this best of world scenario, will only be 44% of the global average. Extreme poverty in Africa will be 127 million, while in the entire rest of the world, there will only be 85 million people living in extreme poverty. And this sustainable world is a best world for Africa. It's an ideal world. It is a world of global collaboration, a rules-based order. That should remind you of the challenges that face Africa and its development potential. Our current development is closer probably to this divided world, where the world economy would be about $172 trillion by 2043. Africa's GDP will only be about 6.7% of that, and GDP per capita will be 39% of the global average. Extreme poverty by 2043, it's way beyond the Sustainable Development Goal in 2030, will be about 198 million people, and extreme poverty in the entire rest of the world, about 112 million people. And then, of course, in the world at war, this gets much worse. And you can look at what that looks like in a growth world. So our final, second last sort of major policy takeaway is just to make the point that Africans must relentlessly pursue their interests, including the conditions for Chinese foreign investment, insist on knowledge transfers and domestic linkages like China did, institute full transparency on all government contracts, and resist political conditionality. No matter what you think of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the associated suffering, it of course does not compare with what happened, for example, in the war in Ethiopia, in Tigray, or if we look at what's happening in Sudan at the moment. So Africans really need to look at their priorities. In a sense, we don't have a dog in the fight, and countries differ when it comes to their views on Ukraine. Finally, if the West is to retain influence and assist Africa, it must de-risk investments in its banks and the private sector, commit to ongoing engagement, communication, and greater visibility on Africa's development prospects, reset relations on China. This is very important. The last time Africa was the most unstable period in Africa's history was shortly before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when competition between the former Warsaw Pact and the West pushed out instability into Africa. And you saw literally continental wars in Southwest Africa and Northeast Africa. We need stability. And then, of course, what Africa needs is a relaunched multilateral system and an investment-oriented growth model that benefits Africa. So Sabina, I'm going to conclude there, I've tried to give you a summary of, firstly, the forecasting work that we've done for every African country. It was a project that took several years, and we have done forecasts for where we think every African country is going in various sectors. And then we've asked the question, how does developments in the rest of the world impact upon Africa and on the world? And I've tried to present you that and the major policy takeaways from our work on the long-term future of Africa and, of course, globally. So thanks very much for inviting me to present this to your network.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yaki, for this thought-provoking presentation. You've unpacked a lot of complex issues here for us, really helped us think in a more systematic way about global and African futures. Since you've done a marvelous job at highlighting the key takeaways, I'll do none of that, also cognizant of the fact that we have limited time today. So I think we can move on straight to the Q&A session. Just to allow our participants to perhaps post a few more questions in the chat box, I'll kick us off with one. And afterwards, I'll go ahead and read some of the questions there in the chat box. So first off, I'm wondering if you would be able to elaborate a bit on the real world implications behind two of the scenarios that you envisage. On the one hand, a sustainable world with, if I noted correctly, 206 million people living in extreme poverty. And on the other hand, a world at war with 710 million people living in extreme poverty. As you noted in your work, in both scenarios, the majority of these people would be living in Africa. So I'm wondering here, based on your data, based on your analysis, what are the first order implications when it comes to food security, water security, energy security, intracontinental migratory pressure, but also perhaps the second order implications, because we do live in a deeply interconnected, intertwined world, much as some of the trends and tendencies that you've highlighted move in a different direction.
Sabina, thanks a lot. So I didn't, as you correctly, I didn't really go into all the scenarios because there are 4 global scenarios, and then there are, in actual fact, 4 African scenarios. There's an African scenario linked with each of the global scenarios. So it's quite a complex system that we've presented. And for example, in the world at the world at war scenario, it's not only that there is a war between NATO and Russia and possibly China, but also that conflict in Africa spills over, and that Africans themselves are in conflict because partly they're driven by external factors. Poverty is higher, people are suffering, people are struggling, the state is weaker. So in the world at war scenario, of course, not only does Africa grow more slowly, people are more desperate, but poverty increases, food security increases, and so on and so forth. So for each of these global scenarios, there is an African scenario. I'm just going to show very briefly the African scenarios that are associated with each of these. Let me just each of those scenarios to get an idea of what are the associated African scenarios. I'm just going to scroll down, sorry, on the page here and go to that chart. Okay, so this is the chart that I didn't discuss this. This is sort of the scenarios that are the African scenarios that are associated with each global scenario. So in the sustainable world, Africa gets more aid, more foreign direct investment, remittances, debt relief, and debt forgiveness. There's less illicit outflows. The continental free trade area is fully implemented. There's deeper trade integration in certain regions, and a growing number of African countries commit to good governance standards. There's more incredible elections, democracy expands, the focus on accountability, good corporate governance practices, and so on. A strong Africa Union with harmonized relations with the regional economic communities, Africa grows at about 7.5% average. That's massive. Whereas if you compare that with a world at war, is where Africa is a small economy with average growth at about 1.1 to 2% annually. In other words, we grow below our population growth rate. Competition between external partners for access and control over the minerals that enable the fourth industrial revolution is rife. Democracy and good governance stalls and often deteriorates. There's little trade integration, and like the Abuja Treaty and others, the Continental Free Trade Area exists in name only. And the role of the African Union is nominal, and there's generally an increase in stability. And in the divided world, there is really no African integration. And in this world, Africa governments are captured by private interest versus corporate interest. So there is a lot of detail on the in the scenario framework. It not only looks at the global scenarios, but also looks at what happens to Africa in each of those scenarios.
Thank you very much for walking us through that. So I see a lot of questions here and in the chat box. Africa two-speed development approach model that you mentioned in your work. What is the role of internal and external actors in this equation? Will this result in a reconfiguration of the AU institutions and the regional economic communities?
Excellent question. So, I mean, the first thing is just simply to restate that the rest of the world will not develop Africa. Africans will develop Africa. And this is all about African leadership and about Africans stepping forward. The international community can and should provide aid to Africa, but the most important thing is to normalize relationships with Africa, to allow for trade, aid, to stop pretending that all of Africa is unstable and at war, and recognize that there are a few African countries that are unstable, but you can fit, Sabina, I'm sure you've seen the charts, you can fit the entire rest of the geography of the world landmass onto Africa. It is so large. And that people think that there's instability in Sudan, that Ghana must be burning, or whatever the example may be. And these are countries that are thousands of kilometers from one another. So it's the statement that's often made, differentiate that if there is war in Ukraine, doesn't mean that things in Spain and Portugal are unstable. And the same needs to hold for the understanding of Africa. Africans, you ask about the regional economic communities, what needs to, so Africa is committed to regional trade integration under the African Continental Free Trade Area. And we have a problem that many of the regional economic communities overlap with one another. East African community overlaps with the economic community of Central African states and with SADC, just to give one example. These things need to be sorted out, but the main enabler and the main obstacle to Africa's growth and development is the commitment by African leaders to development, to good governance. And that really is the main challenge that I think that the continent faces, and that, like everywhere, we are struggling with. I mean, there are all examples of poor leadership and poor governance in many so-called Western and Eastern East Bloc countries, and the same holds for Africa.
Thank you so much. And just to pick up on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and to bring in the AU Free Movement of Persons Protocol, these, as you mentioned in your work, they're considered necessary for unlocking Africa's development, human capital potential. But if I understand correctly, there have been seemingly fewer advancements on the protocol on the free movement of people as compared to the Continental Trade Agreement. Are there concerns, for example, that cross-border movements could contribute to the spillover of violent extremism, terrorism, or contribute to political instability?
So I think that in almost every scenario we do, that it's first to deal with the European elephant in the room, that I think migration is going to increase from Africa, almost irrespective of the scenario. And I think that that is going to strain relations between Africa and Europe. Like in the United States, where we see that the United States, with all its military and economic ability, is unable to stop migration, illegal and legal migration from Central and South America. I think the same is going to happen in Europe. We have this great highway, which is known as the Mediterranean, between North Africa and Southern Europe. And I think, although the migration from Africa is a trickle, it's a few million a year, whereas much of the migration to Europe is from Eastern Europe and Afghanistan and so on. I do think migration is going to remain, it's really going to complicate our relations. Now, on the one hand, Europe has got a declining pool of capital labor that is available, that is in the working age people. And Africa has got a growing pool of labor that can fill Europe's developmental needs. But of course, there are all kinds of issues around race and religion and development and education that will complicate that. So the vast majority of Africa's migration occurs within Africa. Africans move from one country to another, and in actual fact, we are quite a in that sense, there's a lot of population movement. But the concern in Europe with regard to migration and xenophobia, I think that is going to present us with challenges going forward. So it's not easy to regulate. I think it's almost impossible to stop, but we will have to find ways to live in a world where not only capital and intellectual property is more mobile, but also labor is increasingly mobile. And this is going to present both Europe and Africa with many, many challenges going forward. I'm afraid to say, I think it's a big issue.
So thank you very much. I'll take one of the questions from our participants and add a little bit to that on my own. Timothy asks, how can international organizations in the future, UN, NATO, and others, realistically influence African relations towards democracies, despite having a future economic growth projected towards Asia? So what I would add to that, because now Timothy brings in the notion of democracy, one of the things that was curious also when looking at your work in ISS, I was wondering why the choice of to frame the futures according to the dimensions that you did. So for example, globally, you could have also looked at perhaps the rise of autocracy or democracy and consider that. So are we to understand that then that has less of an impact on the development trajectory of Africa as compared to the dimensions you've chosen to look at and to emphasize? So, but please also start with Timothy's questions, if you will, please.
So those scenarios that were developed over many months, and they were presented to various working groups in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa to refine, and that led to the choice of the four global scenarios, the two axes. Because you need a framework to understand the future, because else the world is complicated. And so the reason why we didn't choose democracy or autocracy is there's a huge academic debate that you'll be aware of, which is really, is democracy does democracy follow economic growth, or what is its role in economic growth? I'm of the view that democracy accompanies economic growth. At low levels of development, it's not really that important, but the more higher you come up on the GDP per capita curve, the more democracy becomes basically a requirement. Basically, a competitive economic system requires a competitive political system. So we've spent a whole chapter, by the way, or a whole theme on the website that actually models governance. And we look at governance in three. We sort of use the Westphalian development of governance, from stability to capacity to inclusion, as three dimensions of governance, and we model that in Africa. Of course, the process is very different, because what you have in Africa is an imposed state. So But the trend of democracy in Africa, so as we all know, there have been three large, well, according to Huntington, three waves of democracy. And clearly democracy, the last time that democracy really advanced globally was with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. You saw a huge surge in democracy globally. And in recent years, there's been lots of talk of an autocratic regression, the retreat of democracy. I think over long-term horizons, democracy will again experience another wave. Remember, one of our scenarios, one of the big outliers that we ask ourselves is, what happens with China? At a certain level, average levels of income mean that people want the ability to be able to make a choice about themselves and their children. China is going in the other direction. So are we going to see that China eventually, that pressure for democratization in China changes in the Middle East? I think that the desire for self-actualization is very evident in Africa. I don't think you can take the democracy genie and put it back in the bottle. I think that the trend, you could maybe, if you're in the Middle East and you can grow rapidly enough, China, you can grow rapidly enough, and the state has enough resources, you can try and keep suppress the desire for individual actualization. But I think eventually, certainly in Africa, you can't retreat on that. Certain regions, like West Africa, it doesn't grow rapidly enough. There will be a regression, but over time, I think that the desire towards democratization will reassert itself. And the question really is, will China, will the Middle East be able to resist that? Or will they eventually also democratize, not according to the West, but according to their own model of democracy? So so sorry, a long answer, but I don't think that we are seeing really a retreat in democracy over long-term horizons. I think this thing comes in waves, and it will again, that wave, which is now, will again reassert itself.
Thank you. That's more promising, a bit or positive or optimistic than the current mood. So it's good to have that as well. So we have a little less than 10 minutes left. So I'll take a question from our audience, and then I'll perhaps ask one other question. And I guess we're nearing the end otherwise. So I see here a question on Ukraine. With the reduction of grain to Africa from Ukraine, are nations on the continent taking sides? And if so, how? With whom?
Sorry, I couldn't hear it. Just could you say it again? I can't see the chat function.
So essentially, the question here is whether countries on the African continent are taking sides when it comes to the crisis in Ukraine on account of the fact that there has been a reduction in grain.
Yeah. So Africa is divided. Some countries are sympathetic to Russia. My own country, South Africa, is one. And others are sympathetic to the West and to Ukraine. And if you look at the voting patterns in the United Nations, you'll see that they differ. Russia remains a player in Africa, but its main actions in Africa relate to the provision of the Wagner Group to arms. It has quite a limited trade presence in Africa, but it can provide security. And of course, there are many African countries that the former Soviet Union supported during the liberation struggle. So there's a nostalgia to Russia, but China is a much more influential player across Africa. It's the major trading partner for the large majority of African countries, for Africa as a whole, although much of our trade with China is commodities. Our trade with Europe is much more higher value goods. It's more important. Africa, short answer, Africa is divided. There is no single African position on Ukraine. Africa has been affected by it needs fertilizer, it needs food, and because Africa generally is not food self-sufficient, and we don't produce sufficient fertilizer. So that has been a driver, and therefore the Africans played a role in the agreement on allowing grain shipments from the Black Sea. And again, there is now an initiative by 6 African presidents to speak with both Moscow and with Kyiv, but they have limited leverage. I think that the belief on the side is that eventually China will have leverage over Russia, and through weapon supplies, the US and eventually Europe has leverage on Ukraine. But I mean, the easy way to stop this war is for Russia to stop advancing and, invading another country. But Africa is quite divided on this issue.
Thank you for that. You've also preempted one of the other questions we had. So I know that the ISS approach is very developmentally minded in the work that you've done, but to bring in the security dynamics as well, you mentioned that in the world at war scenario, Daesh would be spreading its influence even further in Africa. What is the forecast on the trajectory of the terrorist group under the other three scenarios?
So the irony is that the main driver of terrorism in Africa, radical Islam, is in actual fact the actions of African security agencies. And that has been true almost across the continent. So people are unhappy. They want resources. They want government to help them. Very often government is absent. And then when government interventions, I'm speaking about African governments, they do so in a particularly repressive and brutal manner. And that often tips rural traditional communities from just being sort of angry at government and to actually taking the AK-47 up. And there's been a lot of studies being done by us and by the UNDP that shows that African security force action is the tipping point that leads to armed action. As we know, the problem in Africa is a lack of security, it's a lack of development. And local communities frame their concerns, their desires within a political context, radical Islam, or whatever the case may be. That's the real driver. So it's not, So the US invasion of Iraq basically displaced Daesh into North Africa. The invasion of, or the attacks in Libya basically meant that was further displaced. And that really set North Africa and West Africa aflame in the Sahel. So we are paying the price for somebody else's war once again. But the major problem on the continent is a problem of poor governance. It's a problem of the inability of the African state to provide a secure developmental context for its own citizens. Instead, they brutalize their own citizens very often. I'm generalizing, but that is very often the experience. And that leads to a sense by traditionalist communities who live in a degree of peace and tranquility to then eventually take up arms. And that's a major factor in terms of the growth of ISIL, Daesh, whichever example you want to use.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for a very short and a very last question and a very short last answer. I saw that one of our participants was curious to know how much you're using AI in your forecasts.
We're using?
Artificial intelligence. AI.
No, actually, we should be having our artificial intelligence on our website shortly, where you can talk to our website. Give it another month. But no, our forecasts are done using a forecasting platform known as the International Futures Forecasting Platform that is hosted and developed at the University of Denver. It's free and open source, by the way. You can go and download the entire platform from their website or ask us, and we can also give it to you. It's used by the UNDP and a variety of others, but it's a massive database and forecasting algorithm.
Okay, so I think this is all we have time for today. For those of you who had some very burning questions to ask that you're really looking forward to an answer, perhaps you can include some of them in the comments section in the feedback form. This is also an incentive to kindly provide us with feedback. Otherwise, thank you, Yaki, very much for the insights and your perspective today. Our sincere thanks from the NSDS Hub also to your colleagues at ISS for the collaboration today. Many thanks to all of those who joined us and for your active participation. We hope that this has been a productive exchange for everyone and that you will choose to tune in again for our future webinars. Now with this, I can bring the webinar to a close on time if I see the watch correctly. Thank you really everyone and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you very much, Sabina, for hosting me.
Thank you, Yaki.
Yes, bye-bye.